So, the last part of this section on contemporary virtue ethics actually isn't contemporary at all. It has to do with the Confucian understanding of virtue ethics. Right? So, Confucian moral principles are very much alike to virtue ethics. However, there is one fundamental difference that shifts the entire understanding in into a focus where virtue is conceived more of as like obligation or duty towards others, and that has to do with the distinction between the Western view of the self and the Eastern view of the self. In ancient philosophies, in their respective ancient philosophies, and how that pervades through the various lines of thinking. So within the Western tradition of philosophy, basically the Greek and European tradition, the self is seen as, a discrete entity, focuses on individual autonomy, and therefore a very individualistic mindset, and the approach to morality is as an individual. And it makes by focusing on like the self-containedness of our own autonomous being, it makes the self separable from the world and from each other. So the way everything lines up is like person A, person B, how do we draw connections between them? It's like drawing a thread between 2 points, right? And we can kind of see how this thread analogy that connects the two, like that's our relationship to various individuals, is played out in our own language. We talk about cutting people off, cutting people out of our lives, cutting the cord, severing bonds, right? As though, that we're letting them loose, right? By comparison, the Eastern view of the self is more like Venn diagrams, right? Where you have person A and person B, and the point of interlap represents their relationship, right? So we define ourselves in the Eastern view of the self. We are defined in an important respect by our relationships to others, right? It is literally part of who we are. Right? It's not just this separate thing that connects us to other people. That connection is a part of us. And we can see this, and so this mentality is more interpersonal. It focuses on how people are not standalone, but are rather connected, and therefore also how we're not separable from each other or the environment. And in many important respects, are in fact defined by those things. And it's a little bit more collectivistic, communicative in its focus. Now, we also see this in our language, right? Think about when someone dies, how the language we use for when someone dies, right? In relation to ourselves. We say, especially someone who we were close to, we say it was like we lost a part of ourselves, right? Because on this view, we really did. We lost a part of ourselves. That friend is no longer there to be a friend for, so all those feelings are just kind of left adrift, right? Now, it's this difference in the view of the self that adjusts the understanding of virtue as a result, right? So as a form of virtue ethics, Confucianism is concerned with the relationship between action and character, right? But character takes on a new meaning under this view, because character has to be importantly defined by your relationships. And in Confucianism, there are 5 principal relationships, right, that all others are kind of derivative of. There's the relationship between subject and ruler. We might just rephrase this as the powerful and the weak, right? And this can just be in any sort of social context, right? Social context. Your boss technically has power over you. That doesn't make him more powerful, like physically, or you weaker, but in the context of your workplace, like he's more powerful than you. Right? He or she is more powerful than you. The father to the son. Remember, Confucianism was a philosophy developed in like 600 BCE. So it was a very in China, which was already which is still patriarchal. So it was very a patrilineal society, and so Confucius formulated this relationship, which we might generalize to parent-child, along the lines of father and son, because that was what was socially of most importance, like the patrilineal line. And then husband and wife, we might broaden this to male or male-female relations. It is meant to be like specifically within the household, but it does have its broader context too. I know that's not non-binary, which some of you may have issue with, but that's an issue to take up with Confucius and Confucian scholars, because that's the one relationship they haven't figured out how to really fully reconfigure in the modern climate. And then we have elder, younger, right? This was formulated specifically in reference to siblings, but again, it also has reference to, it also has implications for like generational gaps, right? The obligation of the elder generation is to lead the younger generation, to impart their wisdom on them, and the younger generation has an obligation under Confucianism to aid and take care of the their elders, right? Right. So again, very collectivistic, communicative mindset here. And then finally, friend to friend. And the relationship of friend to friend is the only one that is amongst pure equals in Confucianism. Right? All the other four have kind of inherent power structure, like power disparity and dynamic. We can get rid of sort of the power disparity in more modern forms of the husband to wife or male to female one. But as it was conceived of by Confucius in his own time, that power disparity did exist. Now, while friend dynamics might develop sort of general power disparities where you have one friend who's always the go-getter, the organizer, the one who makes sure the group does things. When you're talking about more than one friend, right? A single friend. It's not always the case that the same person fills that same role in every friend group that they're a part of, right? Which is why we say it's not a natural power dynamic as a part of the relationship itself. So we take these 5 principal relationships, and they wind up determining in part the appropriate form of the 5 principal virtues and how they should be observed. And these 5 principal virtues are ren, right, which we can translate as sort of benevolence or heart-mind, is another popular one. It's a way of thinking with compassion, essentially. Yi, which translates as honesty or uprightness. Then there's li, the proper rights or behavior or correct behavior, right? And then ji, knowledge, both knowing what is the case and what to do, but it emphasizes more the know how than the know that, right? So know what to do. And then shin, right? Which stands for, which means faithfulness or integrity. So when you pair these 5 relationships and 5 principal virtues together, you get a notion of virtue as duty, as obligation. It's an obligation to act as the relationship in question dictates. And because it begins with a notion of self that is partly defined by the relationship, the unique form of the virtue, right, becomes an obligation to act a certain way, to be virtuous, not just to others, but also to yourself. Right? So by observing the properly the virtues in your individual relationships, you're not just being virtuous of character and morally upright in your relationship with others, but also to yourself. Now, this actually kind of creates a fairly complex dynamic, right? Because a lot of our moral situations aren't just between two people, but 3 or more. So we get sort of a plot-pointing, three-dimensional graph view of how morality works, right? Determining the proper action and everything. As an example, consider the following situation, right? A coworker is being mistreated by your boss, right? And that coworker is essentially an equal to you, a friend, basically friend, right? Neither of you is a more senior partner at your job. You both stand in the same job position, right? So on and so forth. And your boss, however, is your superior and has a certain amount of power over both of you as a result, right? So your boss assumes the ruler-to-ruled relationship to both of you. Now, your boss isn't, mistreating you. And so by virtue of being your boss, they should stand in the same relationship with the other person. What do you do in this situation knowing that your boss is mistreating a coworker, right? That is to say, not observing their obligations to their subjects, more or less, right? Well, you simultaneously are standing in a particular relationship with the coworker, right? And as equals, it's not your right necessarily to go behind your your coworker's back and report the boss for them, but you can make it known that you're willing. You can, you talk with them, right? You have obligations in both directions, right? Which creates a more complicated metric. And again, requires that sort of situational sensitivity that McDowell was going on about. But if your boss is severely mistreating your coworker, right, then you, by virtue of your own position in all of this, you have an obligation to report them, because if they're mistreating one, abusing that relationship in one instance, there's no reason that they might not be abusing their power in that particular relationship dynamic of boss to employee in other cases, right? If it's wrong for them to treat you that way, it's wrong for them to treat your coworker that way. And let's assume for the sake of it that you and your coworker are both of the same gender or gender identity, right? That way, you don't overcomplicate matters by introducing a third factor in this example, right? So as a coworker, you have an obligation to your other coworker. Figuring that out is a little bit more complex, though. Right? And so to act virtuously means to take some form of action against your boss who is acting viciously, even if that form of action is just standing in solidarity or making known your solidarity with your coworker, should they choose to pursue a course of action. All right, and that's everything on virtue ethics.